Senator Bovey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I want to follow this line a little bit. We're aware that several provinces have denied the right for home cultivation, and the provinces are working on that aspect of the bill now. I think the purpose of, or the provision of the bill was to ensure that young people would not receive criminal penalties if they were caught and using cannabis. And the provinces and territories have imposed fines and seizures of cannabis and preventative treatment. So this is a balance of provincial and federal law that is underway now. But given that criminalization causes significant harms to an individual and their families, and as a sort of mother, I can tell you those many decades ago, marijuana was brought to my children's school grounds, and I'm going back to the 1970s. With this, and quite honestly, that was absolutely illegal, and lots of education was done around it. But my concern is, does it make sense to continue to criminalize people, have a criminal record for a use of cannabis? Or are we better to have the regulations in place which prevent selling it and prevent, sort of regulate its use and availability?
No, prohibition does work. When you say it's legal, already, as you mentioned, even in the 70s, even it was illegal, some will use it, and they always will be, whether it's alcohol, cigarettes, or there'll always be those who will use it. But prohibition serves as a guideline to the conscience, and that if it's, and for many people, if it's legal, then it's more acceptable. And if you have access to it, then if it's legally accessible, more and more will use it. And we already have a problem in Canada with our children using marijuana, and we're not. And this is just going to cause even more difficulties, because when you make it legal, it must be all right. It must be healthy. It must be acceptable. And as I say, no law will ever prohibit. There'll always be somebody going to do it, whether it's alcohol or cigarettes or marijuana or cannabis, whatever. But a law does serve to prohibit, to teach, to guide. If you remove the law, then it's legal, and more will use it, who wouldn't use it normally. Presumably your children never touched it, and you know that but there will be children who will, but the more children that will use it if it's accessible and not legally prohibited.
Well, I appreciate your viewpoint, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to agree to disagree on this one, because if we go back to the history of prohibition in the 1930s with alcohol, we found that having regulation was a safer, healthier means of distributing alcohol. So appreciate your viewpoint, but I will take it.
Respond to that. I think it's a very important point you've raised. Do you know that it's a myth that prohibition in the 1920s failed? It did not fail. It was, you still had the speakeasies. People would have access to it, as they always will. But the number of people who stopped drinking alcohol was phenomenal. There was no cirrhosis of the liver under that time. Please don't say, oh, prohibition didn't work. It's convenient to say it, but it did work. And mental illness, all sorts of complications of alcohol simply ceased to exist, because the majority of people were not using alcohol during the prohibition, although there were others who did, such as speakeasies. Okay.
Thank you. We're almost treading on the subject matter of a different committee. We're here on the international aspects. So I'm going to remind senators and witnesses about that. Senator Cordy next.
Thank you, and I know we're not supposed to tread on that, but I can't let it pass either. And maybe it's because I'm from Nova Scotia, which is by the ocean, but prohibition on alcohol did not work. People from ships were bringing it in. It made many people in the community very wealthy, so it didn't work. And I would say that the war on drugs is not working, and I guess we can pretend that marijuana is not being used by people in the public, particularly our young people, but I've never had marijuana, I've never had cannabis in my life, but I'm a believer that regulation will ensure that it's safer. But my question is related to our international obligations. We heard from previous witnesses today that Canada is taking an active role in the United Nations drug discussions as they review the 10-year policy, the 10-year review. So I think, contrary to what you said, Canada is actually taking a leading role. And we know that that they also stated that the global drug policy is quite fractured. We also heard that hearing problem. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Time is going by. That's okay.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry, what was?
Sorry. I said that we've heard from our previous witnesses that Canada is taking an active role with the United Nations in reviewing the drug policy, the 10-year review. We also heard from our previous witnesses that global drug policy is fractured. We also heard that Canada is at the forefront of legalizing marijuana and that other countries are moving in the same direction. And some of the other countries were Jamaica, the Netherlands, Australia, Morocco, South Africa, New Zealand, and I'm just naming a few of them. And as you stated previously in your testimony, we know that 20% of Americans live in a state where cannabis is legal. So this is contrary to some of the comments that you made in your opening statement. So I wonder if you would comment on what we heard from our previous witnesses.
The former comments you heard, it in effect was, oh, well, everybody's going to do it anyway, so we may as well be in the front of it. But that is categorically untrue. When you have the April 2016 review of the drug treaties, and it was unanimous, the world leaders spoke out against the drug, and they said how effective it had been. Mr. DaCosta, who is the head of the Narcotics Control Board, has said prohibition has worked and is working. And it's a very good reason. Antonio Maria Costa has said it is very powerful, the prohibition against the drugs worldwide. And you're not just dealing with developing world. You've got problems in the undeveloped world or the third world countries. And if you remove any prohibition against drugs, as say marijuana, you're going to have enormous troubles there because you don't have the infrastructure that we have here in the developed world. But I can say categorically, I've been at the UN many times. I've discussed this, and I do know that the world leaders have spoken out against it. And in fact, as we said in our brief, anyone who derogated from the drug treaties were very unpopular at any time. And if they said Canada was at the forefront, they're in the forefront of many things lately. But I can tell you they're being but they're out of touch with the world. And certainly most countries categorically do not want drugs to be readily available.
Thank you.